What's up, everyone? Welcome to Bill Bronze and Dragons. I'm your host, Bill Bron Bafflestone. So you may have noticed that I didn't say Dungeons & Dragons 5th Edition Power Gamers Tactics Room. I have been working towards this, and I am now finally implementing the name change. Because, man, I had no idea that a lot of people thought Power Gamer was a pejorative term. I mean, Treant Monk just made this whole video about how he considered power gaming, these horrible people. And if I had known that, I would not have named my channel Power Gamers Tactics Room. I kind of thought it was a neutral term. Silly me. So after doing the poll and doing a lot of thinking about it, I'm going with Bill Bronze and Dragons, and I'm going to update all of my thumbnails and all of that. So yeah, no more Power Gamers Tactics Room. It's Bill Bronze and Dragons from here on out. And today, we are having another episode of my Deep Dive series, this time looking at one of my favorite spells in the game, Tiny Servant. If I had to choose a signature spell for Bill Bron Bafflestone, it would probably be Sleet Storm, but man, Tiny Servant would be like a huge challenger for that title. Because I love Tiny Servant so much that I actually remember the moment that I read the spell description, and I just, my eyes popped, because I had just gained 7th level, and remembering that my DM had foisted 2 cleric levels on me, I was only getting access to 3rd level spells at that point, right? And the 3rd level spells are so amazing, so I'm just reading down the list, trying to figure out which one am I going to add, and it's just like, as you go down the list, it's just like, oh my god, Animate Dead is amazing. But my party freaked out when I suggested that they take it like a couple levels ago, so that's not going to fly. But, oh my god, Counterspell, and Dispel Magic, and Hypnotic Pattern, and Fly, and Slow, and, I mean, there's just so many good ones. Sleet Storm, Phantom Steed. But then I got to Tiny Servant, and I was just like, oh my god. And my mind immediately exploded with all of the things that I could do with Tiny Servants, especially considering that I had a dead 4th level slot that I needed to upcast something into. And Tiny Servant would have upcast into 3 of them. And man, at that point, like, my character completely changed, because I added Sleet Storm, I added Tiny Servant, and I also picked up Phantom Steed through a scroll, and that completely transformed my characters. And all 3 of those things became signatures that were total go-tos that defined all of my tactics going forward, because all of those spells are amazing, and Tiny Servant was one of those spells. So I've been meaning to do this deep dive for quite some time. I'm very excited to talk about it. So without further ado, let's jump right in and talk about Tiny Servants. So I put the spell description on the screen so you can check it out, and we are going to talk a little bit about this spell description and call out a few things that are noteworthy. First of all, I want to point out that you can get this as a Clockwork Soul Sorcerer by swapping out a domain spell. That's one of the not so easy to see ways to get access to Tiny Servant. It has an 8-hour duration, so it will last your entire adventuring day, and you can rest trick it. See my Deep Dive series video on rest tricking for more information about how all that works. Now, do note the items animated must be non-magical. You can't animate like a magic weapon so that you do full damage to creatures that have resistance to non-magical bludgeoning, piercing, slashing. But that said, it's much easier to find targets for animation versus, say, Animate Dead, where you have to locate all of these bones and they take up all of this space. You can just grab a handful of coins and animate those, and you are all good as far as Tiny Servant goes. It upcasts amazingly. You get +2 Tiny Servants per level, and you can get so many. See my Beastly Bladesinger build, see my Artillerist Bladesinger, and see my own Bill Bron Bafflestone build to see how you can realistically get a whole swarm of these things and actually adventure with them. I think it's one of the best ways to utilize dead spell slots for multiclassing. And just as a thought experiment, let's compare casting Tiny Servant at 5th level versus Animate Objects, which is also 5th level and very similar in how the spells work. You would get 5 Tiny Servants, which are always on with an 8-hour duration, no concentration necessary, and no actions to command them if you set them up with standing orders. If you cast animate objects, you'll get 10 of them, and they will do +1 damage and are +3 to hit, but it has a 1-minute duration, it occupies your concentration, and it takes an action to cast. Guys, I will take the Tiny Servants all day long. It has much better output for the 5th level slot. It's going to impact many battles. It's going to offer way more overall utility and defense and action economy. I think animate objects is so overrated, but Tiny Servants are amazeballs. Now, you do have to direct them with a bonus action. This can potentially cause clog issues if you have other strong bonus action options. As a wizard, I never really did, so I could direct them pretty easily. Even though you can only issue 1 command per round, and it's to some or all, so it's a little clunky, because sometimes you do want them to cooperate and do different aspects of a task, and as much as you want to, you can't do it. Now that said, you can issue standing orders to proc different actions on the same trigger. For example, I would use the command trigger Bilbron Buddies Battle Formation, and like one would apply to me an antitoxin, and one would open up a magic item like Ever Smoking Bottle, and then one would like ready a healing potion so that if I took damage, it would just automatically apply it. So you can get a little bit creative with the standing orders and get some cooperation there, but it's not something that you can do in combat. And do note that your standing orders cannot include the ready action, which is intended to be combat specific. Jeremy Crawford clarified that in a tweet. Final thing to note is that damage taken by the Tiny Servant is carried over to the original object, so that might destroy it. Not an issue if you're just using coins or rocks or something, but if you are using more sophisticated constructs, that can be annoying. So now let's take a look at their stat block, which I've also put on the screen so you can check it out. And some things that I'd like to call out. Note that it has Poison, Charmed, Frightened, and Psychic immunity. So you can combo Tiny Servants with things like Stinking Cloud, Cloud Kill, Hypnotic Pattern, Fear, and Synaptic Static. Don't gotta worry about them being in the AoE because they are immune to all of those effects. And note that it also has a Deafness immunity, which implies that it might not be affected by sound abilities. For example, the Chasmy Drone effect. So check with your DM about that. That could be a nice little Benny, and you could combo it with Summon Greater Demon Chasmy. They have 60-foot blind sight, which is amazing. Absolutely fantastic versus invisible enemies. Amazing in heavy obscurement for those immense attack and defensive buffs. And offers elite, always-on detection abilities for the terms of engagement. Tiny Servants come with a 30-foot climb speed, which gives them excellent mobility. But do note they are tiny and weak. They have a strength of 4, so they can only carry up to 30 pounds each. And they can't be grappling and shoving anything unless it's small or tiny. So you can make them out of almost anything, and there's a few things that we should talk about. I like to make mine out of silver so that they do full damage to devils and lycanthropes. And this actually made a huge difference for Bilbron Bafflestone in my final battle, let alone all of the previous battles. But we fought a lot of devils, and in my final battle, I was going face to face with my nemesis, Titivolus, who was an archdevil. And so, yeah, the fact that my Tiny Servants were made out of silver made me chuckle and made him cry. So there you go. Now, you could possibly make these out of adamantine or some such to give them increased durability. There's no real advantages to that, rules as written, but the DM may allow it because it does have an impact with constructs and such. And note that you can create advantageous and sophisticated shapes with Fabricate, Stone Shape, or other similar spells. For example, you can add compartments to carry equipment, or you can create shapes that reflect your role-playing concept. So as an example, I had Thieves' Tools proficiency on Bilbron Bafflestone, so I used Fabricate to create some fairly sophisticated Tiny Servants out of silver that had all these compartments so they could carry poisons and torches and healing potions and all of that fun stuff. They were cool for a while. I have to say they ended up getting destroyed, and I never really went back to that just because it ended up being very advantageous to me to have them at that really tiny coin size. And having them be bigger was just kind of creating some like logistical issues, and I wasn't really pulling the trigger on all of these fancy tactics that I had in mind, like hitting them with acid or blowing Essence of Ether at them. I mean, it's funny, I carried like these 3 doses of Essence of Ether throughout my entire campaign, and I never used it. I guess it just helped me sleep better at night. You can also create shapes that might offer you advantages when it comes to subterfuge. Like rocks in the Underdark aren't going to attract too much attention if they're not moving around. And note that these can be super tiny, like the size of coins. Like the tiny size category is kind of weird in Dungeons & Dragons because it doesn't differentiate below like a certain size. But logistically, having them the size of coins is pretty awesome because you can essentially carry unlimited numbers of them in your pack. And if you really start getting into this whole swarm idea, that's going to be important. If you only got a couple of them, then you might want to, be more sophisticated or use bigger ones. But the fact that you have versatility there is really nice. And note that these things have weak AC and hit points, so they are vulnerable to AoE attacks. I feel like I probably shouldn't have to mention this because anytime I talk about how great tiny servants are, that is the immediate rebuttal. They're just so vulnerable and they'll never be useful. Like I would never cast animate objects. So acknowledging that criticism here, they are weak to AoE. But note that you can combo them with unlimited target AoE temporary hit points to buff their durability, for example, Eldritch Cannon or Twilight Sanctuary. And do note that logistically, AoE attacks can only occur once the tiny servants are on the field. I guess there are some creatures that have like a persistent aura or something, but nobody's going to cast a fireball at a theoretical enemy. They're going to cast it once those enemies show up. And that means that you can guarantee at least one attack sequence when you deploy them. You can just swarm them out of your backpack for a devastating nova. So one of the nice things about Tiny Servant is that it's not just a combat spell like Animate Objects. They offer a lot of utility. Because they have such a long duration, you can prepare them and set them up for certain tactics. So on offense, they can deliver equipment payloads. For example, poison, holy water, oil, acid, caltrips, all of that stuff Tiny Servants can deploy for you. On defense, they can apply potions and good berries and antitoxin to the caster or allies. This is something that I loved to do when I had tons of tiny servants. I would just assign one to each of my party members with a stack of good berries, and believe me, it was hugely effective. You can just assign them to your allies with standing orders to apply these things when they are damaged to get elite action economy. It functions like quasi-regeneration. Again, these things can always alert the caster to the presence of invisible creatures. They've got nothing to do when you're not in combat except sit on your shoulders and keep a lookout for invisible creatures. And they're decent for guard duty with their 60-foot blind sight. Really only appropriate as a backup layer of detection since their passive perception is only 10, and that's not very good. But do note that you can combo them with Magic Mouth to upgrade their detection abilities. I'll talk about that a little more in the next section. They are excellent for menial tasks, like collecting scattered objects, doing dishes, giving you back rubs. One nice way to use these is have them carry a light source up ahead of the party so they can illuminate areas while the party remains in darkness. It's like a concentration-free dancing lights, and it is very tactically useful. Carrying a light source can draw the attention of dark vision creatures if you're like underground or something. But in this case, it will only draw their attention to the tiny servant while you are hidden in darkness outside of the range of their dark vision, and it can be really good. Because they have a climb speed, they can circumvent certain obstacles and do things like secure the ropes for a party to climb, and they are excellent for safely manipulating your environment. They're useful for testing for or triggering traps. They can open possibly hazardous doors and chests and windows and such. They can handle poisonous objects safely. Just a real nice extension of the wizard's manipulation without exposing him to danger. And finally, these things can deliver stuff or messages for you over great distance. They're tireless little servants. They can go all day and will never complain. Finally, a few combos that you might want to consider when you are deploying your tiny servants. Most obviously, heavy obscurement to leverage the blind sight. Oh my goodness, that's so good. You've got a swarm of tiny servants attacking at advantage, being attacked at disadvantage. Just fantastic. And you can also throw in a middleman for that heavy obscurement through Summon Greater Demon. Grab yourself a Babao, that can cast darkness at will. That'll unlock the tiny servant blind sight combo and give you a Babao. Tiny Servants upcast at level 4 for 3 of them is a fantastic combo with Magic Stone. That's going to give you a really impressive ranged attack. You can just issue standing orders so that every time you cast Magic Stone, they grab it and throw it at the nearest enemy. and that can do up to 3d6 plus 15 from the magic stones with your bonus action, and then you can use your action for a cantrip, and that's going to be some pretty elite range damage. You can also combo Tiny Servants with Magic Mouth. I love Magic Mouth. See my deep dive series video on Magic Mouth for more information. It can give your Tiny Servants a fantastic array of detection abilities. It will add vocal capabilities to give you some differentiation amongst those detection abilities. And there is tons of role-playing amusement to be had by putting Magic Mouth on your Tiny Servants. Believe me, if you're creative, it can put a funny little spin on your battles. You can combo it with Dragon's Breath to get better DPR. This is one that I never asked my DM about because to me it's like, well, they don't have mouths, they don't breathe. It doesn't make much sense to me that they could cast Dragon's Breath. Even though rules is written, they probably can. It's just by the time my Tiny Servants were online, I had better things to do with my concentration than cast Dragon's Breath. But you can combo that. You can combo it with Seeming to get an impressive retinue for interactions and deception and subterfuge. You might have to animate bigger objects than coins to make this work, but it's possible. You can combo with Odaluk's Freezing Sphere, create the bead and hand it off to a Tiny Servant, and then you can combo it with another blast that you cast and get an impressive Nova. You can combo it with Arcane Abeyance, and that way you can offload your spell concentration to a Tiny Servant. You can combo it with a Torch for Pyrotechnics. Even if you have dark vision or whatever, it never hurts to have a lit torch around, and that way you can use it to create the smoke you want out of a pyrotechnic spell. You can equip them with nets, and that will give them a nice restrainment attack. You can give them explosives and have them sacrifice themselves with a nice big bang if you're using those variant rules. You can give them magic items like Wand of Magic Missiles. But if you can get multiple Wands of Magic Missiles, because they're just common, and get like 5 or 7 or 10 Tiny Servants all with Wands of Magic Missiles, that would be hilarious and that would be highly effective. You would just be mowing things down left and right. You can combo it with the prone condition on an enemy for attacks at advantage, for example through Shove or Sapping Sting. Bilbron Bafflestone would often use Sapping Sting to prone an enemy to get those juicy attacks at advantage for my swarm of Tiny Servants. Command is good if you use it to proc OAs, because if you've swarmed a guy with Tiny Servants and then he has to eat like 5 or 10 opportunity attacks, that can be a killer right there. If you are using the flanking rule, Tiny Servants are fantastic because they're just going to swarm a dude and you're just going to get constant attacks at advantage. And finally, you can combo it with the Artificer spell storing item ability. Comes online pretty late, but man, anytime you're spitting spells out of your Tiny Servant, man, that's good for a few laughs. So that's it. That is Tiny Servant, one of the most awesome third level spells in the game, even though there are a ton of third level spells competing for that title. Awesome for upcasting, one of my signature spells. I use it in a lot of builds. It's just so good. So let me know what you think in the comments below. Let me know if I missed any really cool ways to use Tiny Servant. And regardless, thank you so much for watching. This has been Bilbrons and Dragons. I'm your host, Bilbron Bafflestone. See you next time.